Are we morally responsible for anything? This is the question we're going to explore in this video. The answer might seem obviously yes, of course, we're morally responsible for some things. But this philosopher here, Galen Strawson, published a paper in which he argued that actually we're not responsible for what we do. And in fact, he argued it's impossible for us to be morally responsible for what we do. This leads to the first problem, the first philosophical problem that we're going to talk about, the problem of autonomy or the problem of responsibility. So I'll explain his argument, and I want you to see what you think about it. The conclusion feels pretty extreme to a lot of people that we're not morally responsible for what we do. But what I recommend is you just put that aside for a minute and just see how he gets to that conclusion. What is his thinking process? And then see what you think about it. Okay, the problem of autonomy. Autonomy comes from two Greek words, auto and nomos. So auto meaning self, and nomos meaning law. So autonomy means self-law or self-determined. If you have autonomy, if you're an autonomous person, that means you can control your own actions. Now, Galen Strawson is going to argue that you don't have that kind of control. And what's interesting about his argument is it relies on the nature of choice itself. So, here's how his argument goes. The first main claim is this: you do what you do because of the way you are. And what he means by the way you are is your character, your personality, your preferences, your values. So, for example, here, a cup of coffee. I just took a drink of my coffee. Why? Because I like coffee. So, I did what I did, took a drink because of the way I am, because of my preferences for coffee. And his claim is that this is true of everything. Why are you taking this class? Because of something you value. Maybe you value a degree, and this class is necessary for a degree. That's why you're taking this class. So, as a general claim, everything we do flows from the way we are: our character, our personality, our preferences, our values, our beliefs, and so on. Otherwise, it would just be random. Our actions would just be random, right? Okay, the second claim is to be morally responsible for what you do, you must be responsible for the way you are. The idea here is that if our actions flow from the way we are, then in order to be responsible for our actions, we must also be responsible for the way we are. His third claim is you actually can't be truly responsible for the way you are. And therefore, if that's true, then you cannot be morally responsible for what you do. You might want to pause this video and read that argument to yourself several times so that you can understand what the argument is claiming. Now, just because it's an argument doesn't mean it's a good argument. Arguments can go wrong in two main ways. Actually, there are more, but two of the main ways. And one of those is if one of the claims, the premises, are false. The other way is if it has bad logic, where the connection between the claims and the conclusion is not good. Now, many people, when they see this argument, they think the argument is a bad argument because they think premise 3 is false. Galen Strawson is claiming you can't be truly responsible for the way you are, and many people think that's just false. Like, I can be responsible for my beliefs and my values and my character. Strawson knows that many people will not find that convincing, and so he gives us an additional argument for that. The way he argues for this is he uses a type of argument That's called a reductio ad absurdum. That's the Latin phrase, reductio ad absurdum. And what that means is reduction to absurdity. This kind of argument, the way it works is if you want to prove a claim, you temporarily assume the opposite of that claim and then appeal to other things that you know are true. And if in the process of that you can generate a contradiction or some other kind of problem, then you know that your temporary assumption is false. And because your temporary assumption was the opposite of the claim that you're trying to prove, if the opposite claim is false, then that means the original claim must be true. Let's see how Strawson defends premise 3. Here's his sub-argument. First of all, assume you can be truly responsible for the way you are. This is that first temporary assumption. So let's go back to premise 3. Premise 3 says you cannot be truly responsible for the way you are. What would the opposite of that be? The opposite would be to say, actually, you can be truly responsible for the way you are. So Strawson says, all right, well, let's temporarily assume that you can be. Okay, if that's the case, then you must have intentionally made yourself the way you are. His thought there is that if you're truly responsible for something, that has to be because you intentionally did that thing. If something was an accident, then you're not as responsible for that. You might not be responsible for it at all if it was completely an accident and couldn't have been foreseen. So there's this connection between what you intentionally do, what you're doing on purpose, and what you're responsible for. So assume you can be truly responsible for the way you are. If in that case, then you must have intentionally made yourself the way you are. Now, if you intentionally made yourself the way you are, that means you chose to be how you are by reference to certain values or goals. Here's what he means. If you do something on purpose, you intentionally do an action, that's because you're trying to accomplish something. If you watch this video intentionally, not just by accident, that's because you're trying to accomplish something. Maybe it's like trying to accomplish getting a certain grade in this class, or maybe it's trying to accomplish understanding a philosophical idea in more depth, or maybe it's trying to accomplish personal growth. Whatever it is, if you're doing it on purpose, that's because you're doing it, your actions are being guided by reference to certain goals or certain values, and that those goals or values are what you're trying to achieve. That's just what it means to do something intentionally. Okay, so if that's the case, then either one of two things is true. Either you based your choice on those values or goals because of the way you are, or you intentionally chose those values or goals. Let's think of a concrete example to make this more understandable. Let's suppose you have made yourself into a disciplined student so that you study regularly, you don't procrastinate very much, and you've made yourself into this kind of person. Now, let's suppose you intentionally did that. Premise C says if you intentionally made yourself the way you are into a disciplined student, then that's because you are trying to achieve certain values or goals. Maybe you want to get a degree. Maybe you want to get certain grades in your classes, and you know that in order to get those grades, you need to be disciplined. Maybe let's say that's what it is, that you want to get good grades. So you intentionally making yourself the way you are is by reference to the value, I want to get good grades. I want to succeed as a student. Now, premise D1 is saying, if you did that intentionally, you made yourself into a disciplined student intentionally, then either you based your choice on that value of getting a good grade just because that's how you're built, that's just how you are. It's like the value of getting a good grade is just hardwired into your brain. Or you intentionally chose that value. You chose to say, you know what? Getting good grades, yes, that is a value I am going to pursue. And in order to pursue it, I need to make myself disciplined. All right, so you see those two options? Now, let's take the first option. If you made yourself a more disciplined student, um, and you base that choice on wanting good grades, if that's just because the way you are, you're just hardwired to want good grades, then you're not truly responsible for that value. You're not responsible for valuing good grades because that's just how you're built. You didn't intentionally choose it. That's just how you are. On the other hand, suppose this is the second case, suppose you intentionally chose to adopt good grades as a value. All right, that's what I'm going to go for. If that's the case, then what that means is you chose those values by reference to some higher set of values. So again, this goes back to the nature of intention. If you intentionally chose good grades as one of your values, if that was intentional, then that means you're trying to accomplish something in making that choice. And that's probably actually the case for you. Why do you want good grades? Maybe because you want a degree. Or maybe you want to have a degree with certain level of achievement. Okay, so let's say that's the case. So you chose the value of good grades intentionally by reference to the higher value, I want a degree. Okay, now, then either one of two things is the case. Either you base that choice on those higher values of getting a degree because of the way you are, or you intentionally chose those higher values. So if you're just kind of like hardwired to want to get a degree, then you're not morally responsible for that because you didn't intentionally choose it. It's just how you're hardwired. But then if you intentionally chose that value of getting a degree, that must mean there's some higher level value by reference to which you're making that choice. And that probably is the case, actually. Like, why would you want a degree? Probably it's because you maybe want a good job. Why do you want a good job? Probably because you want financial security. A lot of people find meaning in life through their work. And maybe you want meaningful work. Maybe you want to be able to support other people you love. So maybe that's why you're choosing the degree. You choose the degree in order to get the job. You choose the job in order to get financial security and provide for other people that you love, right? Eventually, you can see how this reasoning will lead to an infinite regress. If you're intentionally choosing a value, it's because of some higher value, and you can always ask the same question about that higher value. Is that just hardwired into you, or are you intentionally choosing it? If you're intentionally choosing it, there's a higher level value. But if it's just hardwired into you, then you're not truly responsible for that because you didn't have control over it. It's just hardwired into you. Okay, this gets a little abstract, so feel free to rewind the video and work through the whole argument again. But notice what's happened. If we assume that you can be truly responsible for the way you are, and we work down the chain, given what we know about how intentional action works, then either we end up with a contradiction, this contradicting one contradicting A, or we end up with an infinite regress that doesn't stop. And infinite regresses don't explain, so they're not good evidence for anything. What that suggests is that something is wrong with our initial assumption. So if we, in assuming A, we get to these problems, then we should reject A, that we can be truly responsible. And if you reject A, guess what you get? You get the claim that you cannot be truly responsible for the way you are. That's Strawson's argument for premise three. And that's his conclusion, that therefore we cannot be morally responsible for what we do. So, my challenge to you, if you disagree with his conclusion, see if you can find which claim you think might be false in his argument, or which step of the logic you think might be problematic. Because if you can't find, if each claim is true and the logic is good, that means the conclusion has to be true. So if you're going to reject the conclusion, that means you have to be able to explain where the flaw is in the argument. So I recommend that you spend some time with this argument and see if you can do that.